Greetings, everyone. My name is Jonathan Bailey, and I am from the website Plagiarism Today, which can be found at plagiarismtoday.com. Happy Tuesday, everyone. August the 21st, day after my brother's birthday, no less. However, today, one of the things that's been going on is a article on Torrent Freak that's been circulating. It's been kind of making its rounds on the internet. It's all about the RIAA and its budget situation specifically, and it's interesting because what they did is something quite simple. Is they took a look at the tax reports or the tax returns from the RIAA, and they're specifically looking at the 2010-2011. So we're pretty much a year behind with this return. But they're taking a look at it, and they noticed that compared to the return 2 years prior, they have lost. They've gone from a budget of a little bit over 51 million, to a budget of a little bit over 29 million. And that's a drop of about 22 million, give or take. And of course, this has led to headlines all over the internet. The death of the RIAA. The RIAA is dying. It is suffocating. The major labels aren't supporting it anymore. The music industry is, the major labels are dying, etc., etc. And while it's true, the music industry, the last I'd read in the statistics, the major labels had some drop off. It hasn't been, nearly a 45% drop off. So something clearly seemed a bit odd with me in the statistics, and I kept wondering why there was such a sharp drop. But then, in the Torrent Freak article, it does a pretty good job breaking this out, actually. As you look at the actual numbers and why they're so much lower, you notice pretty quickly that the bulk of that drop, the bulk of the $22 million, comes from a decrease in legal expenses. And it's no coincidence that this 2-year window we're talking about here, this window we're talking about, starts right as they were winding down or ending the litigation campaign against individual file shares. That's a pretty big element to this, and that's a buried lead. Their legal fees went down from over 16 million to barely over 2 million. That's a $14 million drop in legal fees, and that's because, well, when you're not suing hundreds of people a year, hundreds if not thousands of people a year, your legal fees tend to, go down. So basically, they had a severe drop in the amount they're paying legal fees. They targeted lawsuits at cyberlockers, at sort of, the higher ups the food chain, rather than going after individual pirates. They went after companies that they felt were inducing piracy rather than individuals. And so when you go from filing thousands of lawsuits per year to only a handful, you definitely see a reduction in legal fees, though you might not, depending on the success of the lawsuits, you might not see a drastic reduction in your impact. And that's really what the RIAA has been going for in the last few years, love them or hate them. Their strategy has been one of trying to maximize the impact they get per dollar rather than simply trying to attract headlines, which was fundamentally what the goal was of the individual lawsuits. Because even though everyone said those individual lawsuits that they did, and then, by the way, they announced they were stopping in 2008, though they actually continued to litigate them on through 2009. But anyways, the reason they did them was to produce headlines, and everyone's like, oh, they're just trying to make money, they're da-da-da-da. But they actually lost a significant amount of money. I'm trying to remember, this was a headline a while back, but it was discovered that for every dollar in settlement they got, they lost or spent something like 10. So it was a pretty ridiculous return there on the individual file sharing lawsuits. They were very unsuccessful from a financial standpoint, though it's debatable how successful they were in sort of creating the conversation and dialogue on piracy. The RIAA feels they were at least moderately successful. The rest of the internet seems to feel that it was not. I'm personally still not sure. I guess time will tell in greater clarity. But the point is, 14 million of that 22 million was unnecessary income. It was dropped because it wasn't doing any good. Another 2 million was gone because they ditched 2 executives, which had a combined salary of about 2 million. And so that still leaves a drop of about 6 million in their funding, and that's definitely not insignificant. But I think most of the funding drop and most of the layoffs can be explained by the fact they stopped suing individual file shares, and they just didn't need the funding. It's worth noting that their lobbying efforts, the efforts to get things like SOPA and PIPA and so forth, have remained largely consistent at about 2.3 million. And in fact, I would not be surprised if that actually increased in the next return. Also, It's worth noting, if you look at the Google Transparency Report, the RIAA and its member companies have been extremely busy filing DMCA takedown notices with Google. I think they've got something to the tune like 800,000 in the past 90 days, I believe is the rolling window there. So they've been very, very active on that front. They're not backing down there. So for those who are saying the RIAA is dying, I definitely don't think they're getting stronger. But I also don't think they're necessarily dying either. Their role is shifting. They are shrinking. They're becoming leaner at least. And they're trying to have a greater impact with fewer dollars. And they've had some pretty big successes in their view in the past few years. So it's not as if they're dying and going away. It's just their direction has shifted and they're doing something that's a lot cheaper. And that being said, also, just because the major labels, which, by the way, don't just simply hand the RIAA money, they also run it. The mere fact they're not giving as much funding to the RIAA does not mean that they're not spending that money on copyright and piracy issues elsewhere. In fact, you can take a look in the Google Transparency Report. You can see these organizations are very active on their own as well. So it could also be some of this is they're trying to invest in their own directions, and also they're doing other things online too. Investments in things like Spotify have been pretty big, Vivo, etc. So the bottom line is this. Yes, the RIAA is taking a funding hit. Most of that's explained by the simple fact they stopped suing individual file sharers, but obviously there's still some income left that has declined legitimately. But that's not necessarily the full story. As usual, to quote the great historian John Green and his show Crash Course World History right here on YouTube, truth defies simplicity. If someone's feeding you a simple narrative of anything, and this is both pro copyright reform, against copyright reform, etc., whatever. If someone's feeding a simple narrative, you probably need to look deeper into the numbers. And this time around, the numbers paint a much more complex picture than what's being preached. And the Torn Freak article actually does a pretty good job covering it. Read the original article. It's pretty fascinating. I'm going to put a link in the description below. It does a pretty good job just pointing out all of this. So it's not as if these are hidden facts or anything like that. It's just sort of the narrative that's been carried in the game of internet telephone has been much more simplified, and that's just the nature of the internet, I suppose. Well, anyways, thank you very much for joining us, and until tomorrow, this is Jonathan Bailey, signing off.